Welcome to Dialogue. The President of the European Council, Charles Michel, has met with Chinese President Xi Jinping and other Chinese leaders in his first visit to China as Council Chief. The visit follows other recent meetings between President Xi and European leaders over the past month. What's on the agenda for the talks? What are the real issues concerning China-EU ties? And as more European countries are engaging with China, is there a crack forming in the US-led anti-China camp? To answer these questions, I'm glad to be joined today by Feng Zhongping, Director of the Institute of European Studies of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Fraser Cameron, Senior Advisor of the European Policy Center in Brussels, and Harvey Dzodin, Senior Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. Fraser, I will start with you. So the President of the European Council now is in Beijing for a visit here. So you are sitting in Brussels, and tell us what's the purpose of his visit to Beijing?
Well, firstly, to re-establish communication at the high level. Under the EU-China strategic dialogue, we are supposed to meet at least once a year, and obviously because of the pandemic, this has not been possible. So face-to-face communication is really important because there's a lot of common ground here, as well as obvious differences. And I think it's important that Charles Michel and Xi Jinping take this opportunity to understand each other better and understand the EU's position on a whole range of issues, as well as China's position.
Zhongping, from the Chinese perspective, what do you make of this trip?
I agree with Fraser. I think the priority now for both sides is to have a better understanding. We had some misunderstandings, differences, but during these 3 years, because of we're not able to have a face-to-face communication, and to the old misunderstandings, we have new misunderstandings, and the differences has been extended. So I agree with Fraser. Now the most important thing, urgent thing, is to re-establish this direct face-to-face communications and to have a better understanding. In the past 3 years, many things has happened in Europe, in China, in other parts of the world. So the two powers, Europe, China, need to have let's say what Europeans are thinking about all this. And Europeans also know what China is thinking about all this, Ukraine crisis, US-China rivalry, G20, climate change issues. There are many issues they need to have a direct, frankly, discussions.
Well, there's a lot to cover, obviously. Harvey, you are American. You stay in the European Union country, inside the EU, Europe, I would say. And you have close contact with the Chinese side. So how do you characterize the current relationship, for example, between China and the European Union?
I think somewhere between good, bad, and ugly. But I agree with my colleagues that it's really important to meet, especially at this time, after the Schultz's visit, after the CPC 20th Congress. And so I think it's very important. But I see this really as a kind of a triangle. And the triangle is comprised of China, the US, and the EU. And I think the EU really has the potential to be the fulcrum, the balancing point that establishes some sense of order between the US and China. So I wouldn't want to be the EU myself at this time, because I think one arm is being pulled by China in a sense, and the other arm is being pulled by America. But I think EU, even though it's a young entity, less than 30 years old, it has a great potential to provide a balance. And as Lord Palmerston said, that there's no such thing as permanent friends or enemies, only permanent interests. And so I can see very clearly that the EU's interests are diverging somewhat from the US, and the US is not happy about it. That's why I think the visit is so important.
Well, as Harvey pointed out, Fraser interests. I mean, there are common interests between China and the EU. For example, trade, investment, I mean, economic issues they need to work together to deal with, and climate change. But also they have the differences. So, what are the top priorities for Michel, on his agenda with Xi Jinping?
Well, the top concerns in Europe, which I think are reflected in China too, are firstly the ongoing war in Ukraine. I mean, that has a knock-on effect on inflation in Europe and the rest of the world. It's causing instability in the global south because the inability to deliver grain. So that's, I think, top of the agenda. Secondly, I think the global economy in terms of supply chains and this disruption that has been caused, how to mitigate this, partly because, again, of Ukraine, partly because of COVID and the different strategies in different countries. And thirdly, the issue that's really top of everyone's agenda, but somehow it slipped down despite what's happened in Egypt, and that's climate change. And you can see almost every day now around the world the impact of climate change and the devastating effect this has had. Now, this is one area where both the EU and China and the triangle, as Harvey mentioned, should be working together. And that, I think, should be, these are the three top issues, I think, of this meeting.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zhongping, we have seen the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was in China a month ago, and the presidency met his French counterpart on the sidelines of the G20 recently. And now we have Michel, the president of the European Council, in Beijing. Are we seeing a united approach from the European side toward China, or they are working on that, basically, in how to engage China for the next few years?
I think that is a dream for European countries. They would like to have a united China policy, and the purpose of this council. Michel is a very unique figure. He's not the member states leader. He's the president of the European Council, which includes on 27 member states leaders. So he has a very special position. His job partly is to unite it all this, to get all the voices together on China. So, but my sense is for him and for other European countries, they want to know how to what degrees China can work together with Europe in fighting many things which Europeans want to do. Fraser mentioned the ongoing Ukraine crisis. That is definitely the number one issue, and other issues. But let me tell you, from Chinese point of view, the top priority is, we are very much concerned about, the so-called decoupling talks, reduce the dependence on China. And essentially, this is the issue about the supply chain, the safety of the supply chain. China, very much relied on, this very important market. When we talk about the dependence, it's not just Germany depends. European countries depend on China. China also depends Europe, because this is our number one trade partner, biggest market. So I think these things are worries about China. So China wants to, talking about other things. Among other things, we want to talk about, actually reduce these topics. Actually, it's about the trust, mutual trust. China wants to re-establish the trust, mutual trust between China and European countries.
Mm-hmm. Harvey, the foreign policy chief of the European Union, Joseph Borrell, said that the European Union does not want to choose between China and the US. They don't want to see a world that's divided between different camps. So is that representative of the European countries?
I think, as I said before, the Europeans are kind of caught in the middle. So everybody would like to find a balance that works for them. For many years, for most of its existence, the EU has basically been the lapdog of the United States. And these interests are starting to diverge more broadly. So we've seen in the last month or so that the US has basically declared technological economic war on China with the ban on the nano chips, the advanced chips, and also about the CHIPS Act itself, where Europe is basically shut out and is not going to be subject to get subsidies and things like that unless they move their operations to the United States. So I think everybody's trying to find a balance here. It's a very difficult situation. And if you look at the EU, if you see how the EU is structured, it's an amazing bureaucratic entity. It's very, very complicated. So I don't envy Michel, but he's a former prime minister of Belgium, and I think he has good political sense. And I think in his job, trying to coordinate and align the member state leaders, it's almost impossible. But I'd say he will do the best job that he can, and it's probably going to be a decent job at that.
Mm-hmm. Well, Fraser, we talked about the common development in terms of the economy, because basically every side of the Chinese economy is in a difficult situation. European Union, the United States is not really in good shape, for example. So we do need to work together in that respect, to make sure that it's the safety of supply chain and market access, for example. Well, for that you can technical issues, you can talk to each other to work on that. But what about the talk of decoupling or over dependence on China? So is that as popular as not long ago, let's say? I mean, we can see that we depend each other, as Zhongping pointed out. China is also concerned about, because the European Union represents one of the largest, or if not the largest, trading partner for China.
Well, there are some concerns. I mean, you saw that with the American pressure on Europe to reduce the influence of Huawei, in certain areas, and that was a very public case. Harvey mentioned the chip case recently. In Europe, there is growing concern about the potential impact of any country taking over some strategic sectors. The debate is particularly acute in Germany just now. Germany is preparing a new China strategy, and they will obviously take these aspects into consideration. And there are well-known divisions within the German government in terms of how to approach China. So I think it's in a state of flux at the moment. I don't think there's going to be any radical change, because even the Green Economy Minister, Robert Habeck, recognizes that there has to be no sudden change in the world economy, that any changes have to be very carefully thought out. And above all, we have to protect, the interests, of all these partners. One other important visit I should add is, of course, that President Macron is going for the first state visit under the Biden presidency to the White House this week. And top of his agenda will be some of the economic and trade issues that I mentioned before, in terms of the protectionist attitude of America, which impacts both China and Europe.
Mm-hmm. Well, Fraser, speak of that, and what about the imperative in terms of the economic development for the European Union countries? For example, there's the Ukraine war. Obviously, it is affecting the countries in terms of energy shortage, inflation, and of course climate change, food security issues. Are those issues? So how pressing are those issues for the governments? You have to find a way probably to strengthen the relationship probably with Washington, with China, with Asian countries, so we can do a better job in terms of economy.
Well, first and foremost, it concerns the energy sector, and you see a rush to diversify. Individual countries have signed big deals. Germany signed a 9-year deal with Qatar, for example. And this is going on as we speak, and the European Union is engaged in negotiations for a price cap on dealing with imports of Russian oil, for example. There's no question the big loser in this will be the Russian energy sector, because they've lost essentially their biggest market. And therefore, while Europe diversifies, there's going to be increased prices. That's obvious, leading to inflation. And this is now being tackled, at the global level as well as at regional level. And the Middle East is a big part to play in this, as well as other African countries and South America. New developments in technology are now being given a boost as well. So this factor alone is the principal cause of the inflation, but European countries together have recognized the need to do something about this and are working together to do this with partners around the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zhongping, we know, like for the Chinese side, they will do very much to see a stabilized relationship with the US, with the European Union, and with probably more trade, more investment. China always talk about win-win because that's mutually beneficial. But then there's a request from the European Union, to exercise the Chinese influence over Russia, for example, to help resolve the Ukraine crisis, to end the crisis. How likely, China would play a role in that respect?
Well, we noticed, this is on the agenda between China, President Xi Jinping and Chancellor Michel, Chancellor Scholz. We have to recognize this is the most important thing for as far as Europe is concerned in Ukraine crisis. Fraser mentioned all the consequences of this ongoing crisis, not just the security, but also economic, social impact, and the consequences is not just in Europe. It's actually the global consequences. So this is actually the common things, a common interest for both China and European countries. I think we both want to have a quickly to stop this war, early end of this war. This is the one thing. Second, I think to cope with the consequences, China, Europe can do something together. China can play a role. Europe certainly is doing this. So it's not just only not about just to end the war. China helps through its own ways to bring the war to an end as quick as possible. But also we have a role to play together to deal with the global consequences, regional consequences the conflict has a cost for the Europeans and other parts of the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, Zhongping, can we talk to our audience, basically, in particular audience in the West, they would probably have questions, or lack of understanding. China is also, let's put aside the different understanding, differences in understanding, let's say, for the reasons of the war over there. China is actually was put in the awkward situation because of the war, between Russia and the European Union, between Russia and the West in general. China wants to maintain basically relationship with every country, each side, but it's very difficult. It's a tight rope to walk here for China.
Certainly, this conflict surprised China as well. I think Chinese position is well, we do not want to have this ongoing conflict. This is not in China's interest. So we will do our best to end this. And at the same time, as I have just mentioned, we want to, with other countries because this bad consequences for everybody. So we want to, to do something to stop this fighting. I think that is why European leaders, partly this is part of their mission. They want to come to China to talk with Chinese leaders. They want Chinese leaders to listen to their views, their attitudes, their concerns, and that get some understandings. And hopefully we could do something together.
Mm-hmm. Well, Harvey, we talked about Michel here in China. He's the president of the European Council, represents the views of the 27 members. But as we said, it's very difficult to reach consensus, for 27 members here. How difficult for him to try to be the only representative of the 27 countries in terms of dealing with China or dealing with the US here?
I think it's very, very difficult given the EU's makeup. It's such a complex model of governance and decision making. A German leader once said that you don't want to see sausage or laws made in public because it's quite an ugly, both are quite an ugly process. And so I think the EU typifies that because they have so many overlapping institutions that not only work together, but zero-sum each other out. And so you have a situation even now with Mr. Michel and the European Commission President van der Leyen. They have never gotten along. They're enemies. Their staffs don't talk to each other, but they're the two top leaders who have to make this sausage, who have to make the policy. And so this is a real shortcoming of the EU as an institution. And I imagine, because the EU is relatively young at 29 years or so, that it's going to work these things out in the future. But they don't have that much luxury of time because the issues are so pressing now. So I hope that the leaders can internally can make their differences lessen them so that they can focus on what's good for the EU, for China, US, and the world, because we're all in this together. And if we don't solve these problems, we're not going to be here for much longer.
Mm-hmm. Well, Fraser, speak of the differences, the European Council, European Commission. Tell us, obviously they have different functions for Michel and van der Leyen. They are not getting along really well. How is that affecting their jobs or the overall approach for the European Union to other countries?
Well, it's not good that they don't get along very well, but I mean, traditionally, the setup, as Harvey said, has not been conducive to having, one single authority, and people have got used to this. There are different responsibilities. The European Commission has the money, has the lead in trade and climate change, and has taken the lead on the Russian-Ukraine energy issue as well. So I think von der Leyen has certainly increased her profile quite considerably. And of course, Michel has been struggling to find a role for himself. He's trying to firstly chair, 27 members with different views, and secondly, project a common position onto the world stage. So it's not an easy task. It never has been an easy task. And sometimes people with different personalities do it in a different way. But it's the structure that we have. I think most foreign countries do understand that there's this dual system at the top, and they simply have to deal with each personality when they come and explain what the EU position is. Not ideal, but it's not impossible to work with either.
Mm-hmm. Well, different personalities here, the differences. Harvey, we know that there's a meeting ongoing basically between the European Union and the United States. The US is reportedly by Financial Times, pressuring the European Union to talk tough on China and to basically create concrete steps against China. I mean, how likely is it the European Union or European Union countries will accept that demand and act along with the US against China?
I think a lot of it's going to come down to lip service by the EU. Of course, the EU and the US share some common values that may differ from China's. So I think the EU is going to walk the walk. They're going to talk about human rights and things like that. They're going to criticize and push China on those kinds of issues, even though most of them are internal affairs for China, but they're still going to push anyway. But I think when it comes right down to it, as I said before, I think the interests of both are diverging to some extent. And so the EU, I think, increasingly is going to follow its own light, its own path in terms of its national interest. And I think we're going to see more and more that the EU is going to diverge. For example, on this business about the chips, France, the Netherlands, for example, they're livid about how this chips ban is going to affect their companies, their economy, and so on. This is a clear difference between the US and EU, and I don't see it getting any better. actually. And that's why I think that this triangle is going to become more and more important. And I think it's going to become more and more balanced as time goes on.
Well, Zhongping, as Harvey said, that the U.S. is, basically defending its interests, and the European Union is trying to fight for their interests. For example, the U.S. is pressuring actually both Japan and the Netherlands in terms of banning their companies from exporting to the China market for advanced tools to make chips of their. And also the US is having its own Inflation Reduction Act, for example, subsidizing companies making production inside the US, but not, for example, the EVs from the European Union or other parts of the world. So are you seeing that the European Union countries are getting more independent or more aware of defending their own interests?
Very good question. During the Donald Trump's 4 years, Europe was actually, afraid of the reliable of the United States, and that is, there were a lot of talk about the strategic autonomy, and Harvey mentioned, the Europeans did not want to, choose the side, between China and the United States. But the Ukraine crisis at the beginning of this year has changed something. A lot of European countries have realized, they need United States, they need NATO to help them, to defend them. So you saw this, closeness of this United States and European countries as far as China policy is concerned. But with this ongoing crisis in Ukraine and the divergences, economic divergence has become more and more clear. It always be the case, politically, security, in security areas and in so-called value areas, U.S. Europe is always there. They are all together. But when you come to trade issues, economic issues, there are two different economic actors. They have their own interests to defend. So, we have to stay in the environment. Certain period of environment will help them, to get closer. Certain period of the time, they will get more divergent.
Well, with that, we come to the end of today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.